Hello. Hi, I'm Chris Cook. I'm an editor here at Tortoise. Thank you ever so much for joining us. A lot of familiar names from the education world I see in the have joined us this evening, and I'm not surprised because we have a great panel to discuss this sort of vexed question of how on earth you actually do university admissions in a world where no one trusts exam results from schools. This is a ThinkIn. If you've not been to one before, the purpose is basically it's us outsourcing thinking about journalism. If you go to a news outlet, they traditionally have news meetings in the mornings where everyone gathered together is a journalist. That's how they choose and make decisions on where to go. The problem with that is fundamentally that journalists know a lot about typefaces and leading and page weight. They don't know a lot about the outside world. So this is a process that we've set up, the ThinkIn, to try and bring people who actually know about reality into the conversation. We're delighted that we're doing this partnership in a partnership with the PSC, which is a public services consultancy. The PSC is its best known member is Bob Kerslake, the former head of the civil service, and Antonio Weiss, who is with us. I was just hoping we'd say a few words to start off and kick us off. Antonio. This is a bit local radio, this bit where I have to sort of going to Antonio on line 3.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks all for joining. It's such a pleasure to be hosting this. So I'm Antonio Weiss. I'm one of the partners at the PSC, and I lead our education practice. And I think kind of the word from the sponsors is the bit where everyone kind of goes to hopefully get a glass of wine or something else. So I'll just be very, very quick. All I'll say is that we were founded 15 years ago on the premise that strong public services or education systems, we believe, are the keys to a stronger and better society. And I think the discussion this evening touches on so many intricate elements and challenges that we have for how do we achieve that. It's issues of fairness and access, it's issues of efficiency and matching, and issues around the labour market and flexibility. And of course, in all of that, there's a combination of kind of what do universities need, what does society need, and of course, fundamentally what the students need. So it's a fascinating topic, and we've got, I think, a peerless panel of experts, but also wonderful guests as well in the audience who've got lots to contribute. So I don't want to take up any more time, and just to say thank you so much for joining, and I hope all of you joining also please do obviously contribute to what will be a brilliant discussion.
I should say that thanks ever so much, Antonio. I should say that if you look in the chat bar, you'll see there will be, I'm sure, an active conversation. My colleague Phoebe, who is an alumna of Exeter, which will come relevant later, will be in the comments to marshal conversation there. If you would like to speak, if you'd like to have a contribution to make on camera, if you click on participants and then raise hand, that will flag to me that you would like to speak. I'm going to now just quickly tell you who we've got with us today. So Sir Steve Smith is one of our panelists. He's just stood down after a long run as the Vice Chancellor at Exeter University and is now the UK government's international education champion. Steve was for many years, if I might say, the shop steward, I think, of the Vice Chancellors. I don't know if you mind that, the former president of UUK, and a sort of leading light in higher education. We've also got Sir Chris Husbands, who's the Vice Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam. Chris was also previously the Director at the Institute of Education and is the chair of the Teaching Excellence Framework, the process by which government hopes to bully universities to take teaching more seriously, or I think he might dispute that description. We also have Dr. Jill Winus, who is an associate professor at UCL at the new Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities. Jill is someone who is going to explain to me repeatedly why I'm wrong about all of these things. She's a particular expert on assessment, results, and validity is one of the things where I'm keen to hear from her at. We also have Anne-Marie Canning. Anne-Marie is one of these people who is known to basically everyone in education land, partly because she was part of the team, she's very modest about it, part of the team that was responsible for helping King's College London set up its very innovative and remarkable widening participation programs. If you're looking for answering the question of how do we find kids who we know are good enough for courses, King's had to find some innovative solutions. I'm actually now going to start there by going to my colleague Phoebe, who was just going to run us through 5 quick slides to help us sort of just all know where we are on this question. Phoebe, are you there?
I am here. Just going to wait for the slides from my colleague Kajinder. Fantastic. So, as you can see, that first slide, we ran these at the beginning as well. So that first slide there shows the rise in UCAS applications this year. So you can kind of see that tracking from 2012 to 2020. So there was 514,000 applications, up 1.6% on June 2019, and a record 40.5% of all 18-year-olds in the UK applying. That's last year's equivalent figure was 38.9%. So this is also interesting because there's actually 1.5% less 18-year-olds in the population than last year. So that's not adjusted for that. So you can kind of see that huge uptick in UCAS applications. And then if you go on to the next slide, if that's okay. Yeah, so also on the uptake was, if I'm sure you guys will remember this as well, was A-level and GCSE grades increasing. So you can see there's that small increase on GCSE for the C, A star to C grade, and then for whoever got an A as well, so 28.8% up to 26.2%. So the really interesting one there in white is the A star grade as well. So that's 7.8% up to 14.4%. You'll also remember that this doesn't take into account private and non-private schools. So there is a disparity between those, and Chris has previously written on this as well, and that doesn't show specifically. So and this is all incredibly important because this is what you need to go into university. So if we go to the next slide. And this is a study done by Cambridge Assessment, looking actually around extended project qualifications and the impact, but looking at the correlation between grades at A level, then moving on to the probability of grades at university. So that's the chances of getting an upper second, a 2-1, and probability of achieving a first. So the kind of the process of it is they're coming into the university, there's more people applying to university, more people with that A star grade, and then that's where the kind of the issues start, because necessarily that model is not based off this disparity and these changes and the constant changes in the education process. So
the key thing here, Phoebe, is that,
yeah,
isn't it, is that the A levels have a particular meaning to universities because they know they're reliable, they have been historically reliable predictors of university success.
Yeah.
But if you mess around with the grade distribution like we did last year and will be doing in future years, they will no longer have that property.
Yeah, especially if you're looking at that first figure, because you can see that huge jump in between the 28% and the 54% on a probability of achieving a first. So that's going to cause problems down the line that we probably won't see for a couple more years either, because they're just coming to university now. And if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is something that me and Chris chatted a bit about, is kind of modelling off what's actually happening to each cohort. So 2020 cohorts, that's current year 13s or upper 6th, they'll have their real GCSE grades, but unclear results for A levels in summer 2021. And clearly as well, part of this conversation is the news today from Wales saying that they will cancel their exams for the upcoming summer. So, you know, what's going to happen for that A level cohort? And then the 2021 cohort, those current year 12s, they'll have the CAG GCSEs, but unclear A levels. And the 2022 cohort is kind of we aren't really sure what's going to happen, how these grade systems are going to change. And this is all, of course, coming around recent changes to A level grades, the new systems of the numbered instead of the grade systems, the changes in A levels. All of this means that that previous slide kind of showing those trends towards university grades, and then clearly afterwards with jobs as well, and the impact on that is all kind of in motion at the moment, and really hard to model. And if we look to the final slide. Yeah, so this is also something that I'm sure we will discuss, is the attendance rate at primary and secondary school, because as we come up to the end of secondary school, that's when those grades are, but there's been a real impact at the moment on attendance. You can see Liverpool there that you've just flagged, that's right on that top end of cases per 100,000. This is the week ending 16th of October, so just kind of around the half-term mark, and attendance rate. So it's really, really impactful on those communities who are who have been impacted specifically by the virus. So like the Northwest, in the North, those were in tier 2, tier 3 lockdowns before we went to national lockdown. You can also see secondary schools are way more dispersed down at the bottom. That kind of reflects that higher grade, the older students who again are going to be those students taking GCSEs, taking the A levels. Also interesting, just to flag from that, is that special schools, so those schools that support those with mental or physical disabilities, have had a real decrease as well in attendance. So those students who need that extra support, that in-person support, clearly because of other mitigating factors, do not have the ability to go into school. So I'm sure that's something we'll talk about later. But yeah, there's a lot of varying factors that we really don't know for the next few years.
Okay,
and that's it.
Cool. So I think the big thing from those 5 slides is, if you go back to the old world before the crisis, we had exams that were actually pretty good at helping universities pick out who would likely to do well and who'd be likely to do poorly in university exams. We now know that because they have a different distribution, they can no longer have the same statistical properties. We also know that this year, trying to pick people on the basis of those exams is going to be additionally complicated by the fact that we know a load of students are simply just not going to be getting taught as well as other students. The disparity between school experience is going to be wildly different. So we're going to come first actually to Chris Husbands. So Chris Husbands from Sheffield Hallam. Chris has already written calling for basically dropping exams for this year and trying something else. Chris, can you just explain your thinking on this?
Yeah. Okay, certainly. And I'm incredibly intimidated by the audience, let alone the rest of my panel. Good evening. So look, the kerfuffle over the Welsh decision in the last 24 hours not to run exams next year is not to do, I think, with the detail of the policy decision itself, but tends to be based on a foundational split between those who believe in terminal examinations for a mixture of educational, social, and sometimes moral reasons, and those who don't believe in terminal examinations for a mix of political, social, and sometimes moral reasons. So the position I took up with David Eastwood, Vice-Chancellor at Birmingham, was a different one. And we start from 2 key observations. First, it is going to be impossible to run a set of examinations in 2021 which will provide useful and usable information on attainment. All of the workarounds that have been discussed, the wider use of optional papers, more open book exams, essentially accept that point. It may be possible to technically run exams and technically award grades, but because of the lost learning and the differential lost learning that we've seen on the slides that we put up, those results will not be useful. In particular, state schools will do much less well, and they will rightly cry foul. And in those circumstances, I suspect in the middle of 2021, we have a kerfuffle as big as the row in 2020. The second observation that we make is that learning is more important than assessment. From a university point of view, what we need is the students who are coming in to have covered the A-level curriculum. And in this sense, the workarounds, more option papers, are very unhelpful. It's equally unhelpful that significant numbers of students will have missed out on big chunks of learning, and we are already seeing that in this year. Students are coming in with big gaps in their learning. So we suggest 2 things, and they are both important. And unfortunately, in the reporting of what David and I wrote, only one of them has been picked up, so they're both important. The first is that we decide now to abandon the 2021 exam series, and we use the time, and we've got several months, to ask the awarding bodies to develop a genuinely robust process for the moderation of centre assessed grades, which they did not have time to do from March in 2020. Use the time sensibly to develop a system. And the second recommendation is that we teach students all the way, A-level students, all the way through to late July. We do that in order to cover more ground. Learning is more important than assessment. We make up for lost learning. And that's got several pluses. It narrows the gap between schools, between school and university, lost in the summer. It covers more of the syllabus. My own view is that government is still going to need to acknowledge the impossibility of running exams in 2021. Better to be prepared and make the decision now. Under the approach that we take, and I've nearly finished, universities would use the centre assessed grades. And my solution here is not quite perhaps as well thought through as is going to stand up, but it rests on this assumption. The admissions process is already inefficient and it produces a meaningless hyperselectivity. All but a handful of universities are both, in reality, selecting and recruiting. All but 5 or 6 universities. Given strong applications, given that position, even relatively successful universities will drop grades a long way in clearing to recruit. So my solution for next year is that each university for each course sets a lower threshold below which they will not accept students. No university can then admit students below that threshold. So you have to set your threshold at the level of your weakest point. Above that, places are allocated by lot based on the applications of students.
Well, so, I mean, that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen, but I'm being provocative.
No, but we'll come back to that sort of the thought though. Can we go to Jill Winus, please, next? So Jill, your research covers lots of things, but the reliability of the information we have about young people is that is a key part of this question. Can universities select based on things that aren't exams, and how reliable can we be without in this current environment?
Yeah, thanks Chris, and thanks for having me. Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about this question about how universities can pick students if no one trusts exams, I mean, I think we need to take a bit of a step back and think a bit about what the alternatives to exams actually are. I mean, I agree with both Chris's that exams this year are going to be very flawed if they're carried out in the way that they always are, because of the learning losses and the differential learning losses, etc. But before we completely condemn them, I think we do need to think about what the alternatives are and whether they're actually any better. So, for example, we could forget about exams and do something like ongoing teacher assessment, like they're talking about doing, or they are going to do in Scotland for the National Fives, assessing pupils on the basis of coursework. And in a way that could be a safe choice. Everyone would get a grade. It would take account of the fact that if we can't have exams, everyone would have a grade. But the research does tell us that there are biases associated with ongoing teacher assessment. And there's a very interesting paper by Simon Burgess and Ellen Greaves that shows that for Key Stage 2, when you compare teacher assessment to exams, teachers can under-assess certain groups of students. FSM students and ethnic minority students were under-assessed by teachers. So I think there's a danger in going towards something like a teacher assessment model that we need to be aware of. There's another issue really with teacher assessment or with marking people through coursework, which is that it leaves open greater possibilities for interference from parents and teachers and so on. So I don't think that's necessarily a great way to go. So maybe it's better to go fully radical, as has been suggested, and just abolish exams altogether, and just have a school leaving certificate, like the sort of thing they have in the US. And that would certainly level the playing field, but it brings us, entirely around to the question of this thinking, which is how do universities then choose students if they don't have a reliable metric to compare them with. And my worry really is that in the absence of exam results, that universities will turn to things like soft metrics, you know, like personal statements, interviews, those kinds of things. And we know from research that those things can be very biased towards low-income students as well. And personal statements have been shown to be, you know, to favour those from richer backgrounds, for example. They might also turn to aptitude tests. You know, universities often set their own exams themselves. And again, they've been shown to be, you know, bad news for social mobility. Low-income students are less likely to do those tests, and they do worse in them, according to some research. So that's a concern as well. You know, what about GCSEs? I do wonder if maybe that could be an interesting way for universities to choose students. You know, students have already sat their GCSEs, they're externally marked, they're externally set, and they happened pre-pandemic. So, you know, that could be an interesting solution. However, again, there are issues with using GCSEs to grade, you know, to judge students who are at A-level stage. And we've done some research, myself and colleagues have done some research and found that actually GCSEs aren't the greatest predictor of A-level grades, because students, you know, change their trajectories. Some students end up overperforming where you think they might have performed on the basis of their GCSEs. And it's often students from state schools, high achieving students from state schools who tend to have gone on to do better in their A-levels than they did in their GCSEs, as it were. So GCSEs aren't the most reliable indicator either. So it seems to me that actually, with all of that in mind, you know, we shouldn't write off exams as the way to assess students. I agree entirely that exams are, you know, it's very problematic this year, but there are, you know, ways to make exams more flexible, such as in the Welsh model. You know, they're making the timing of the exams more flexible. We can make the content more flexible too by introducing extra options and designing exams to be, you know, to allow students to choose the questions that they are prepared for, so that we would get some sense of how well they did, or what they have learned. But I mean, I think the very last thing I want to say is that I think this year, contextualizing has never been more important in terms of university admissions. And we know that universities have dabbled their feet in contextualized offers, some of them more than others. But I think this really is the year for universities to embrace that. You know, one of the big fears with contextual admissions is that we don't want to let in students who might fail because they're not prepared for the course. Well, I think that's going to be the norm this year. Many students aren't going to be prepared for the courses, so universities are going to have to take steps to help students to catch up on core material. So that seems to me to be a great opportunity just to really think about contextualizing admissions this year and really thinking about the background that students have come from. And I'll leave it there because I've gone on for a bit.
Thanks ever so much. So that neatly segues into Sir Steve, because Steve, you were for many years one of the sort of leading lights on contextual admissions, one of the sort of core advocates. Contextual admissions meaning universities giving offers based on not just on grades, but on the circumstances in which the student achieved the grades. So you acknowledge that a kid with A's from Eton has probably not achieved as much as a kid with A's from a tough school. Steve, in fact, I think you're the chair of Supporting Professionalised Admissions, which was the sort of pro-contextual admissions task force. Steve, can you tell me what you'd be thinking about now if you were still running admissions? You just stood down for an Exeter last month or the month before. Oh, you're muted, Steve. Hang on, we've got to unmute you. This is the rate. This is
it. Sorry. No. So thanks, Chris. I mean, firstly, I've been 18 years of VC, and there's some really unintended consequences of what are meant to be acts to help the process, and the unintended consequence is, of course, that if you're not careful, you end up damaging the very students you're trying to help. I mean, on the one hand, you've got the very, very strong literature on the effect of school type on A-level performance and subsequent degree performance, which shows on average that students from independent schools perform as if they'd got one A-level grade lower per A-level than students from state schools. You've got that effect. And then you've got the problem of accuracy of the predictions. And last summer, I was still VC until the end of August. And last summer, as several people on the call will know from their own experience, the change in A-level grading caused an extremely serious problem. At Exeter, just to give you the figures, we were looking for 5,800, and we suddenly were told on the Monday that centre assessed grades would be used. That gave us another 2,100. Now, with the best will in the world, that was a really serious issue. So whatever happens this year, if Chris and David's suggestions are followed, timing is going to be incredibly important. But the problem I would be worried about most is the problem of the politics of adjusting teacher grades. I've got some data, which I won't go through, but the data on teacher predictions this year, or centre assessed grades this year, as you know, roughly speaking, 50% increase in the number of A's and A stars. That really, for all the reasons that we saw in Phoebe's slides, that shows you the problem. How do you say actually the grades your teacher assessed you on are not going to be the grades we're going to be used? The politics of the adjustment is extremely serious, very difficult to undertake. And the final comment, Chris, is you've got the issue of the socioeconomic pattern of over and under prediction. The Sutton Trust argument that, you know, there's 1,000 students in the cohort each year from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds who should be going to quote, higher tariff institutions. And then you've got the fact that 54% of FE predicted grades are over predicted, and whereas compared to only 30% of independent school grades. So you've got a really serious issue there, managing admissions, but crucially managing the expectations of students who turn around and say, well, hang on, my teacher said I should have got an A, why haven't you given it to me? And all of that then produces a problem whereby, you know, you get extreme turbulence in the sector. Oh, just one last point. That's why we worked with government. Chris was involved in this as well, to try and get a stabilization package this year, because our worry was, if we didn't do that, we would have seen a mass movement if A-level grades were adjusted towards higher ranking institutions. And that would have been disastrous for the stability of the sector.
Can I ask what you think we should do this year, Steve? If you were still running admissions at Exeter, or let's say a fictional university, what your approach would be? I mean, I can't understand how we can have conditional offers this year when we don't know at all how many grades there are going to be.
Well, as you said, I'm a massive advocate of contextual offers, and I suspect that the big battle in the next 9 months is going to be over the extent to which there's support for contextual offers. I mean, if you don't make contextual offers and you run exams, then you are really, really damaging socioeconomic participation at the lowest socioeconomic groups. What I'd do this year, whatever I did, I would make sure, it disadvantaged least the most disadvantaged socioeconomically. And secondly, I would try and make sure we announced whatever we're going to do ahead of time. Personally, I think exams still have a massive role in all of this. But the key for me is what the data show us on which processes least disadvantage the people that we're most trying to level up. But getting the political air cover for contextual offers, I think, is a very, very key part of that.
Do you think that would mean more unconditional offers this year?
I think unconditional offers are extremely difficult in the sector at the moment. Government, I think, you know, had we not had the summer and had we not been in a pandemic, I think there would have been action on unconditional offers.
What do you think, they'd have been clamping down on them?
Yes, absolutely. Because there's different types of unconditional offers, right?
So,
And the point being simply, as Mary Kernock Cook knows better than anyone, if you actually look at the sticker price of what grades universities say they offer at, and then actually look what the grade students go in with, they're very, very different types of grades. And that causes enormous issues, I think, for running admissions if you say anything is a contextual offer. A contextual offer of 3 Bs might be a contextual offer in one institution, 2 Es might be a contextual offer somewhere else.
Can I, so just so I got it clear in my head, you think we should basically run, if you like, normal admissions with a much with more contextual understanding, if you like, more willingness to offer with a lower grade target to some schools?
Yes, to those schools where we've got a track record of data that shows that students perform poorly, not because of their ability, but because of the circumstances in which they're being educated. But that is a very tough political ask at the moment.
Right. Thanks ever so much, Steve. Can I now come to Anne-Marie? So Anne-Marie, you are the reason why you're a higher education celebrity is King's College's success at reaching out beyond and finding people who are not normally picked up, basically, by their system. You're now, I should point out, you're running the Brilliant Club, which is a really fantastic mentoring scheme. I should give you a plug for that. But can you just, what do you think? What should we do? Is this an opportunity, or is this just unmitigated disaster?
Yeah, I mean, I've got 3 main points, and the first one is the nature of selectivity. I think we need to be really honest. There's no such thing really anymore as a selective university. We've got selective courses. Often they're accompanied with examination or entrance tests. And so I think there is a route through on those hyper-selective sort of spotlight course areas. And the thing that actually worries me right now in terms of selectivity is the student number controls. So one of the reasons we've been able to make such brilliant gains in who gets to go to university is because we didn't have restrictions on how many students could go to university. And the government brought that back last year for the admissions round just gone, and then moved away from it. I think we need clarity on how many students the government is happy for them to go to university this year. But I think really there is an opportunity here. There's an opportunity here to build a new type of admission system. Listen, no admission system is neutral. It's not that the old system was a beautiful neutral system. No system is neutral. And so what we did at King's is we built a system that recognised that. We built a system that was really about spotting potential rather than some sort of arcane prize-giving ceremony, which I think many admissions processes became in recent years. We're looking at performance in context. How is this student doing in relation to where they're being educated? And Jill will rightly point out that when you look at any single piece of data, be it GCSE grades, be it centre assessed grades, whatever it is, it won't be perfect on its own. And so the trick to building a really beautiful, fair and humane admission system is blending together different data sets. Now, the reality is if you're running a wholeheartedly contextualized admission system, grades are just an entitlement to submit an application, right? That's all they are. They're the first gatepost. But actually what's more important is a range of those soft things that Jill talked about. So at King's, we blended together a whole range of information. And yes, that included teacher references, personal statements, those sorts of things. But it also meant we looked at work that students had done. So for example, we looked at the Brilliant Club assignments that students had done, which are marked as if they're an undergraduate piece of work. We looked at what students had participated in terms of widening participation programs. Yes, we looked at the data about their background, but if anything was missing, we chased it down. If the teacher reference wasn't good enough, we said, can you tell us a bit more about this student? And we started really from a position of how can we make an offer for this student? How can we help this student to progress? And that meant we essentially adopted a system that was a mock-up of what they do at Harvard. So despite any accusations of dumbing down, we were taking inspiration from the Harvard close reading system, holistically assessing candidates, bringing them to a moderation meeting and seeing what we could put in place to support those students to progress. So I'll give you a great example. A student who's had no teaching in a particular subject, we would put in place additional mathematical tutoring. Let's say it's their maths A level that they've not had their teaching in. And then we'd think about what they needed in order to transition to higher education successfully. So I think the whole nature of the debate, selection, I really think that the focus needs to move towards support. There's an opportunity here that universities could grasp alongside schools to give students the knowledge, confidence, and skill sets they need to progress to university and flourish once they're there. So there is an opportunity to build a different type of admission system if we're brave enough to do it.
Okay, can I come back to Chris Husbands? So Chris is, I think, not entirely serious, not a suggestion that's advanced possibly to provoke more than as a doable system. Was that you would effectively have a floor beyond which would be a gateway in, and all the places above that will be allocated by lot?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's a line that's being used about President Trump about taking you seriously but not literally, or literally but not seriously. And my proposal was to be taken seriously but not literally. Here's what's going on in my proposal, and I do take the points about contextual admissions and some of the changes. There is a curious game that goes on under admissions, which is the one that Anne-Marie talked about, which is that the published grades at which universities say they're admitting are not necessarily the grades at which they're admitting. And that creates, in the currency of admissions, that is debased coinage, because it's being used by universities as signalling behaviour, not as recruiting behaviour. So the point of my proposal is that it requires every university to identify the real tariff below which they won't go. And then it takes away from them selectivity above that. And I haven't run the numbers, and I'm rather suspect that other people can run them better than me. But I think that that would get you to a less hyper-selective system, which in the short and medium term would produce greater equity in higher education. And the problem, and I'm interested you talk about Harvard, Anne-Marie, because almost when it picks up some of Jill's points about exams. So America does not have an examination-based system. And that creates a problem for universities. And into that problem goes a wide variety of admissions practices. But in that problem, there is the well-known, the college mismatch problem is a well-worn feature of American higher education research, which is where kids who have grades do not apply for courses that they would be qualified for, because they think it's not for the likes of them. And so what I'm trying to do is to get away from this slightly chalet school model that we have, where you've got these autarkic schools and these autarkic institutions, and you're doing a very inefficient non-matching system between them. So I don't think that my proposal is a serious one for 2020, but I think it gets you to a more equitable place in the medium term.
Right. Steve, can I ask you about foundation years and catching up, and if you're thinking about, I don't know how first years are coping at the moment, your current first years, but how much work would you be having to think about putting into making sure that your first years can sort of can keep going next year, who had this enormous gap in their learning?
Yeah, and also of course, Chris, I mean, we're because we've used a very extensive contextual admissions program, Exeter. By the way, we have to show the governing body at every year that the grades, the performance of students that come in through contextual admissions is actually is up there with students who don't. And in fact, they perform slightly better, which is, you know, what specialists would tell you was the case. But what we do is we do quite a lot of work when they come in anyway to support them. And I think, you know, this year, next year is going to be really tough for the reasons that came out in the slides, that people will have missed out on an enormous amount of education. The problem, of course, with Chris's innovative and serious proposal is, when I chaired UCAS, and again, Mary will remember this very well, trying to get universities to agree to publish their entry grades was actually impossible, because it was a market position, and that was really difficult. But to answer your question, Chris, you'd absolutely want to put in a lot of support for students, which is what all the universities that take in a large number of what we traditionally call WP students or contextual offer students would do.
Right, Chris, I can see is waving his hands. Chris Husbands is. If Gajinder, if we could hang on a minute, you're muted. You're muted. Hang on.
Sorry. The point of my idea, Steve, is that it requires universities to be honest about their grades, and because they can't avoid that in my system. And the second thing, just on conditional offers, I mean, you're absolutely right that government dislikes them. The consequence of what happened in 2020 was that the government essentially mandated unconditional offers right across the system.
Right. Yeah. The can we go to Ali Harbour next? Ali has talked in the chat about being a teacher. Hiya. You mentioned you're worried about the disciplinary consequences in school, or the motivational consequences of getting rid of terminal exams. Can you what's your thoughts?
Yeah, just to pick up really on what Sir Chris was saying, I really respect the view that learning is key rather than assessment. Of course I do. I'm a teacher. I support that. But the vast majority of the students that I teach, that I supervise, they really want to sit exams in order to demonstrate their learning in that sort of way. And indeed, when I look at the year 12s who haven't had the opportunity to sit their GCSEs, it is really quite pronounced, their lack of sense of closure on that really important academic section of their lives before they've progressed through to A levels. And of course, there's lots of skills that they haven't had the opportunity to develop. And of course, Steve's talked about that and how that's manifested itself at university. Those things are going to be exacerbated in the coming years. And that's something for schools to really focus in on. But that lack of motivation, the idea that we would continue to teach right through to the end of July without exams being there, I think would be unsustainable really for young people. I can see Chris mouthing at me, but when I look at the children who sit in front of me, the levels of anxiety that they are displaying, I'm afraid, I think from a pastoral and an academic perspective, I think it would be a real struggle to do that. And that's certainly a plea, if I may, for honesty in university admissions, for parents, for students, for teachers. Honesty would really help us all. I really understand the idea of how a tariff below which universities wouldn't be prepared to go, whereas we all know that the published entry criteria is not what happens on results day. And therefore, when you go backwards from that, when you're advising students, when you're writing personal statements, when you're writing references, it skews the entire process for young people in a way that I believe is extremely unhelpful.
I mean, one of the suggestions I've seen out there is that we should maintain the illusion that we're going to have exams until the last minute and then pull them, because we all know they won't work, which I suspect would be a disaster for universities, even if it fixes the problems for schools. Can we go to Maya Ojla?
Yes, that's right.
Hi, so you're a sixth former.
Yes, that's correct. I've just finished my A levels. I was caught up in the 2020 fiasco, and I'm now on a gap year. So one thing that I wanted to highlight was uni admissions for gap year students. So I've received A level results based on my CAGs. How am I going to compare to students applying this year who may not have exam results? I was just wondering if the panelists could shed some light on that, please.
I think that's, I mean, the really, one of the really big questions actually this year is when they award A levels, are they going to be benchmarked against 2019 when there are fewer A's and A stars, or 2020, or are they going to have another round? I think they've hinted that they're not going to try and pull back the number of higher grades. But well, actually, Jill, I was wondering if you could talk about comparability. So one of the and you know, there's sort of what you're sort of thinking about this sort of the scale of this problem at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that there has been quite a bit of talk about predicted grades so far, and I do think there are major problems with predicted grades, with the whole predicted grade system, which we've been using for a long time, you know. And so my research has shown that teacher predictions, they tend to be over predicted for the vast majority of students, although it's really important to say that some groups of students receive under predictions. So students from high attaining students from low SES backgrounds and from comprehensive schools tend to be under predicted versus other students. And so I think that's, you know, there are definitely issues with the CAGs, because they were obviously based on teacher predictions, and that really needs, that really changed the patterns of enrollment this year. So I agree that, you know, they're not going to be comparable with what happens going forward, depending on what happens going forward. But I would definitely caution against, you know, there is a big fear that the UK government will not make a decision straight away and will leave it to the last minute and bury their heads under the sand, and we'll end up in this situation again. And I think that's really dangerous, because you know, centre assessed grades, predicted grades are, you know, they're not necessarily a great reflection of what students' actual grades would have been.
Chris Husbands, can I ask you what you're going to be doing about my video's gone off. Chris, what's Sheffield Hallam going to be doing about different exams? How are you thinking about it? Can you give Maya some reassurance that she won't be penalised or even get a free hit from being in last year?
So I can't give you an entirely straight answer to that. We're running two systems at the moment. We're working on us. We have to have two operational assumptions. Number one, on the assumption that the A-level grades go ahead, and that we're going to be running a conventional UCAS system, and then the likelihood that there will be a shift to centre assessed grades. And I think that's difficult all round. It's difficult for school teachers like Ali. I get the point. I think it's really difficult for candidates. And the feedback I get from sixth forms is that students just don't believe that their exams are going to go ahead, irrespective of the injunctions from the Secretary of State. And it's really tough for university admissions staff. So we're looking at how we operate two different models. And I'm getting quite defensive in some respects. I agree with Jill about the problems of teacher assessed grades. Absolutely, and understand all of that. What we were suggesting in the Eastwood Husband proposal was that if you gear the system up now, you can start to build contextualization into that. You actually take the time to understand the school level processes, and you task the awarding bodies with really developing a system. And if you can do that, and it may ultimately be a mix of some local tests plus centre assessed grades, with moderation, we can make it work in other parts of the system. We ought to be able to make it work.
Okay, and the Steve, can I ask you, just sort of in the reference to some of the things that were saying in the comments, the Welsh problem that was emerged. So we now have, there's always been a sort of difference between and a contextual admissions, problem in comparing English and Welsh grades and Northern Irish, actually. There's always obviously been an entirely different currency for Scotland. We're now going to have a different hire for kids who come from Scotland for next year. Their higher five will be different. We're going to have different GCSEs for England and Wales potentially this year. How sort of alive to university to these things in your experience as the contextual are?
Extremely alive, and an awful lot of professional work goes on to try and get the balance right. I mean, but to be quite blunt, and you've got to remember that one of the things that, of course, is driving this, the elephant in the room, is student numbers. And, you know, we're looking at this quite rightly from the point of view of applicants. And the key, I think, always is to be fair to applicants. But because, you know, again, as Chris will know from his own experience, there were institutions that were extremely threatened by some of the trends data last summer. And, you know, but for COVID, I think we could be in a slightly different world now, where a group of institutions were facing the government's restructuring regime. That was definitely part of the debate during the spring and summer. So yes, you're absolutely right. We do look at all those things, and it's getting more complicated, and this year's going to be the most difficult ever. And remember, there's more students coming through this year and a prediction of an increased participation rate. So it will be competitive, but nonetheless, I think institutions will be looking at this, you know, in part from how do they make sure that they've got the resourcing that's coming in, picked up in the questioning, by the way, but international student fees, etc. Remember, the Treasury estimate of what international student reductions would be was 80%.
Right.
And it was nothing like that in the end. So there's that whole financial side, and that drives the behavior of universities. But what they will do, of course, is absolutely try and make sure that they've got ways of comparing the grades. But this year's going to be really difficult.
Can I just one thing there, Steve? So I think you and Anne-Marie actually sort of are in a fairly similar place in that you think the solution to the problem is spending more money and time on going through the applications and pulling out all the information you possibly can. I think that's a sort of reasonable, sort of run a conventional process, but be alive to the fact that you're going to have to put a lot more energy into working out who the right candidates are this year.
And the politics.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just wanted to check we're sort of actually try and answer the question at some point. Can we go to Thomas Godfrey, who's had his hand up for actually a little while?
Sure, yeah. Just before I start, I want to echo something that Ali's already said about when students have nothing to work for, suddenly their productivity vanishes. And I was in this position in March. We had the announcement from Gavin Williamson saying exams were cancelled, and suddenly everyone's productivity went through the floor and nothing got done. And I'm probably one of the only people here, I think Maya's spoken already, who can attest to just how heart-wrenching it is to see people you grow up with have their dreams snatched away from them by something they have absolutely no control over. There were no students involved in building this algorithm, and it somehow ruined a lot of students' university transitions. And a lot of students I know, I had one friend who missed her grades to Durham, subsequently secured a place at York through clearing only for the U-turn, run around, revolving door algorithm saga to give her the grades for Durham, but that university was already full. Great definition there. I don't think it's a situation we can put school leavers in again. And for all the talk that we get, I was taught for 13 years, learn from your mistakes, do better next time. I think it's time we actually start applying this to the government and to the grade awarding system. So whilst in the last academic year, I think everyone in the education system, students, teachers, government themselves, were shell-shocked by this pandemic, a mutant algorithm, the threat of schools shutting their doors once again. This year, we have to be more vigilant, more careful, and actually contextualise more. And that comes back to what Jill and Steve have said already. But from what I've heard this year from friends in the year below me, I'm at university now, I got through unscathed, was one of the lucky ones with one of those dreaded unconditional offers that many of the panelists have been panning tonight, which is fair enough. I think a lot of students now, from what I've heard, they're more anxious and they're more worried. Not only is the pandemic on, but their exams. And I think someone said earlier that students at heart don't believe their exams are going to happen this year. And that's totally understandable given what happened last year, given the government's penchant for announcing things incredibly late. But to borrow a phrase from Jimmy Carter, England students are heading for a crisis of confidence. We know how that turned out for Jimmy Carter. We hope we can't say the same about this year's students. But with contextualization, I think universities have to be more personal with admissions this year. They have to be more ready. They have to spend more. They have to get involved more, because this year's students will not slot into little Microsoft Access databases or into Excel columns or even into an algorithm. So let's take all the variants that are at play this year, a mental health epidemic that is starting to really overrun students, not just at university, but in sixth form as well, heightened by missing several months of school, which, by the way, in a 2-year course is a huge amount of time. And I don't think I could have coped with doing exams if I'd missed even 3 or 4 months of school. Some of these students have maybe missed 4 or 5, given the return to school that in some places has been staggered and sometimes has been online. this is a once in 100-year pandemic, and I think we need to start treating everything with a bit of contextualization, and that includes this year's admissions and this year's exams.
So thank you, Thomas. That was great. Can I come back to Anne-Marie, who I saw waving her hand?
Yeah, I think really what we're landing on is that contextualized admissions. It's not a goodly widening participation thing. It's an absolute necessity of running a professional and fit for purpose admission system this year. So if I was in charge of running an admission system, what I'd do is I'd dial down the exams. I'd keep the exams to keep student motivation in place, because every teacher I speak to is in a similar place to Ali, and I'd dial up the other stuff. I'd put a lot of effort into making holistic assessments about students. And then here's how I'd structure their offers. I would make them a standard level offer of their grades. I would make them a safety net offer, so they knew that they could land somewhere else and still be able to progress to university. And here's the thing, the offer would be conditional on undertaking a program of transition preparation work. It's something that's proven to be highly effective, using that summer period, offering additional tutoring and preparation so students can feel really confident about progressing. Because throughout all of this discussion, there's not enough focus on what it feels like for young people. I really feel for young people. I felt for them even before COVID hit, when they lost their AS levels, because being at sea without a yardstick about how you're doing is really not a great position to be in terms of making good choices about what is the right university for you and where you'd like to head in the future.
Steve, can I come back to you on your one of the things that I fret about? One of the reasons why I've suggested we should cancel grades, conventional grades, is that my slight terror is that the reason if we issue a thing that's called an A level, and it has a grade structure that looks like a normal A level, universities will fall into the rhythm of treating it like a normal A level. Am I right to be worried about that?
Yes, you are. You are absolutely right. The issue is, how do we come up with a system that does what Anne-Marie's talking about, which enables us to treat applicants individually, and doesn't fall back? I mean, the problem with the A-level predictions and the problems of the relationship between that and socioeconomic disadvantage are profound and deep, which is why we're going to be on to this topic soon. We're going to be talking about post-qualification admissions again. That's the UCAS proposal. I was on both task forces that looked at it, and it was sunk both times because it damaged the most disadvantaged. So there's, it's the old H.L. Mencken thing: to every complex human problem, there's a simple solution, and it's always wrong. So the crucial question is, how do we do that in a world in which, although CAGs are very appealing in many ways, you just have to look at the level of inflation to realize there is an issue, and how do we deal with that?
Right. Can we come to Mary Kernock-Cook? Mary's been mentioned a few times in this conversation, so I feel like we should give her an opportunity to speak. Mary is the former head of UCAS, the former chief executive of UCAS. So in another time, she'd have been dealing with this pile up. Mary, what are your sort of thoughts on, if you like, how we've sort of had I think I'm right in saying that apart from Chris and his desire to destroy the whole process, we've got a bit of a consensus around the idea that the solution has to be a load more intensive knowledge about the individual students. What are as someone who's actually run UCAS, what's your response to that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Chris. And I've listened to the discussion with a kind of mixture of despair and joy, really. I mean, there's a couple of things to say. Is that in each of the next, or 2020, 2021 and 2022, assuming that A levels in 2022 aren't up the spout as well, the university applicants will have had at least one set of exams which were taken in kind of normal conditions, and that would be either GCSEs or A levels in the case of the later cohort in 2022. I know from the data that there's a really strong correlation between GCSE performance and A level performance, and coupled with predicted grades, which for all their flaws are actually an incredibly stable set of predictions in the data set, from which both universities and UCAS can figure out what's going to happen in the system, and it happens pretty efficiently every year. I mean, nearly 3/4 of all applicants get into their first choice university. So somehow that predicted grade system actually works for the vast majority of people. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that there aren't a small number of people for whom it doesn't work, and the sort of things that Anne-Marie was talking about are really important to kind of try and pick those people up. So my own view for what it's worth is that exams are the best option this year. It's not going to be perfect, and there'll be all sorts of problems with kids who've missed more or less learning, or have actually missed the exams. And I hope the regulator will stand up some good contingency options. But it's the only way that we get a national benchmark actually at the end of all of this crisis of how much learning has been lost and how well people have done. I mean, there is a question, as I think Steve said, about where you peg the results, against 2019 or against 2020, or more likely somewhere in between. And then universities need to kind of go down the Anne-Marie route of putting in activities which will pick up the people who've missed more learning, and that's the reason why they've got lower grades. I just don't think we can stand up a system of central assessed grades in the time available that will be properly moderated and will give admissions officers the information that they can trust from one school to another, or from one pupil to another, in a system which, as others have said, still has selectivity in it. Steve, I think I'm right, for the sort of 2,000 or so applicants that you want to accept, you've probably had, I don't know, 8 or 10 times as many applicants in that. This is no small task that has to be got on with. And one thing I learned while I was at UCAS is, tinker with this very finely balanced ecosystem at your peril. I think we've got so many variables in the system because of the COVID crisis that actually keeping some of the the solid pegs in the ground is probably the safest way of doing it. I like Chris Husband's view of the world very much, but Chris, I have to tell you that there isn't a known entry grade floor for universities. They only set that after they know the results, mostly after they know the results of the cohort coming through, because we do have actually a post-qualification admission system. Universities accept the people who've met the conditions of their offer, and then they balance up quality, which is a kind of a harsh way of talking about individuals and their exam grades, against quantity of students, the actual physical room that they've got to admit students. And so those kind of floor grades are really only set by universities when they see how the end of the cycle is playing out. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but actually what we see in the system is that it works really quite well for the vast majority of students in normal times. What we've got to do this year is figure out how we can put those more kind of individual interventions in to kind of scoop up the applicants who have been particularly disadvantaged by losing learning, or who've missed school because of illness and so on.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. I should point out it's now 7:35. We now run over. So I should release you all. But thank you ever so much for coming. I really want to thank the PSC whose contribution has been able to has enabled this. We'd like to thank Sir Steve Smith, Sir Chris Husbands, Anne-Marie Canning, and Professor Jill Winus from UCL, who have basically, I feel like I've got closer in my own head to working out what I think about all of this, which is that the solution is unfortunately really, really expensive and involves universities spending loads and loads and loads of money on a horrifically detailed entry process. Even if we try and run a normal UCAS process, the sort of turbocharged contextual admissions appear to be the answer. I do think it would be a real shame and totally typical of UKHE if we were to go through this crisis and then have the same UCAS process in 2 years' time with all of the known problems with it sort of surviving. I entirely expect that to happen, but yes. So I should point out, if you're a student, there are free student memberships. Phoebe has just posted the link in the chat. Thanks ever so much for coming. We will, I'm sure, return to some of this because it's going to be a bit of a tire fire next year. So thanks all for your time.